In our history of the American West, what kinds of people do we usually think of? Well, we think of cowboys, we think of Indians, but in reality, history teaches us that there were many more folks out there moving westward and creating new lives for themselves. That brings me to something very special I want to show you all. You see, I have me a letter. This letter has been passed down in my family for 4 generations. From my great-grandmother to my grandfather to my mother, and now it's been given to me. I've had to wait 4 generations to this day because today I get to open it. Now, I cannot imagine what could be inside. Maybe it's a treasure map. Maybe it's Lincoln's signature. Maybe it's something important like that. But before I open my very special letter, I want to tell you guys a story. You see, just as important as a letter this old is the woman who delivered this letter. Her name was Stagecoach Mary Fields, and she was the most proud, famous mail carrier of all time. Now, when Stagecoach Mary was grown, well, she was famous. Everybody knew her name. But when she was born, she was just a slave. Take our time back to Hickman County, Tennessee. What was in Hickman County, Tennessee? There was a plantation. On that plantation worked slaves. One of those slaves happened to be a very young Mary Fields. Now, this plantation was owned by a large man, a gruff man named Judge Dunn. Judge Dunn had him one daughter in this whole wide world, and her name was Dolly. And it just so happened, Dolly and Mary Fields were the very best of friends. Now, y'all have to realize, this didn't happen a whole lot back then. You see, for the longest time in our nation's history, blacks were considered different than whites. We weren't as important because, well, slaves couldn't go to school. They oftentimes didn't know how to read or how to write. But Mary Fields, well, she could. You see, she could not accept that just because she was a girl, just because she was black, that she shouldn't be allowed to learn just like anybody else in the Old West. So one day she asked her best friend Dolly, "Well, Dolly, would you teach me how to read just like you do?" And y'all know what Dolly said? Dolly said yes. And it wasn't long before Mary Fields picked it up and they were passing notes back and forth to each other just like any 2 other little girls in the Old West. And this was the first time that Mary Fields proved she was just as strong, just as stubborn, and just as smart as anybody else in all that Old West. Now, because many slaves didn't know how to read and how to write, they had to figure out some other way to communicate to one another. They discovered something called call and response. Now, what that is a method of communication that involves song. You see, persons would sing out questions, and other persons in a group would answer in unison. So somebody might sing out something like, "How do I get to the promised land?" And everybody else might sing back to them, "Wade in the water." And that way they could send a message, and the master wouldn't know what they were talking about, would think that they were just singing. So let me sing y'all a little bit more of that song, and I'll tell you what message I'm trying to send to you, all right? Goes something like this. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, now wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Well, I went to the water, but the water's cold. Wade in the water. It chilled my body, but not my soul. Wade in the water. All right. So that was a little bit of call and response right there. Wade in the water. What it meant was, well, I was wishing you all safety out there on the road. Call and response was used to help people traveling up north to freedom using the Underground Railroad. So I was telling y'all to get in the water, because it's not so easy to track you with dogs and tracking your footprints if you've been in the water. And it may be cold, but that way lies our salvation too. Now, speaking of salvation, speaking of freedom, Mary Fields did not remain a slave forever. No. Around 1865, there was this nice man named President Lincoln that wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. That meant for the first time in our nation's history, all the slaves were free. So what do you do with freedom? Well, honestly, Mary Fields didn't know it at first. She had a job for a while just working around the plantation for the Dunns, but she got her first real job on a steamboat, traveling up and down the Mississippi River. Now, Mary Fields loved her life on the water, but she discovered, well, she missed her friend. Turns out she had gotten a letter just like the one we'd looked at earlier, and that letter was from Miss Dolly. Turns out Miss Dolly had moved all the way out west, made a new life for herself at some place called St. Peter's Mission School for Native American girls. Miss Dolly had become a nun. Her new name was Sister Amadeus. And, well, she missed her friend, too. She asked if Miss Mary Fields would travel out there and be with her at the mission school. Well, Mary Fields didn't want her to be all lonesome, so Mary saddled up on her big gray stallion by the name of Sky, and she rode her way out west to be with her friend out there in Montana territory. Can you imagine the sight of Mary Fields when she arrived? When she rode into town, she was dressed like a man, something not too usual for a lady to do. Not only was she dressed like a man, she had a flask of whiskey on her hip. She had a big old cigar hanging out of her mouth. She had 2 6-shooters and a shotgun laid across her lap. Now, why do you think Mary Fields had all that firepower? Well, I'll tell you, the West was wild back then. Not only did you have bandits and Indians that maybe would attack you out there on the road, but you had coyotes, you had bears, you had wolves. All sorts of dangers awaited you as you traveled. And Mary Fields traveled all by herself and had to protect herself. And now she would be in charge of protecting those nuns at St. Peter's Mission School, too. Can you imagine the sight of Mary Fields? Yes. Now, Mary Fields had more jobs than just, well, protecting those nuns with her firepower. Mary Fields had to climb up all the way to the rooftops of St. Peter's Mission and work on the roofs. Mary Fields had to get down and work on the fences at St. Peter's Mission. She'd have to get down low and work in the fields at the mission school to help with the growing of food. And she'd even gather up feed in her apron every morning and feed over 400 chickens. That's a lot of scrambled eggs, ain't it? Now, Mary Fields was so good at all her different jobs that she was eventually promoted to foreman, or boss, of the whole St. Peter's Mission School. Now, as you can imagine, not everybody liked the sound of that. In fact, there were a few men that especially didn't like the sound of that. You see, Mary Fields was earning $2 more a month than any man on the whole property. Now, does $2 sound like a whole lot of money? No, it sure doesn't. Well, you see, back in the day, that was a whole mess of money. And those men were sore to see it gone. So, one of these men was so sore that they challenged Mary Fields to a fight. Now, you have to know something about Miss Mary Fields. If you opened up the Great Falls Examiner out there in Cascade, you would see that Mary Fields was renowned for breaking more noses than anybody else in the Old West. So you didn't want to get close to her. No, she'd pop you in your nose. So this man, when he had this fight with Mary Fields, he brought a gun to the fight. Now, before he could squeeze the trigger, before he could lay low Miss Mary Fields had her own pistol drawn out the holster. She had her sights set on this fella, and instead of ending his life, she put a bullet in his butt to warn him not to mess with the likes of her at St. Peter's Mission any longer. Now, even though she just shot in self-defense, Mary Fields, well, she was dismissed by the good bishop at St. Peter's Mission School, who could not have violence at his school. And there was Our Lady without another job. It was about this time that the United States Postal Service announced they needed somebody brave, somebody courageous to ride the mail from Cascade, Montana, all the way to St. Peter's Mission School. And, well, Mary Fields thought she was man enough for the job. Now, why was this kind of job so important? Well, we have to think a bit. You see, letters were very important back then. Letters were the way people communicated with those loved ones that, well, they moved out west and made new lives for themselves. Otherwise, you didn't have the telephone. You didn't have your Xbox. You didn't have your wireless connections. You didn't have your Facebook, your Twitter, all those different ways we have to communicate with one another. All you had were your letters. So the person who carried all those letters on their back, their blood and their sweat and their tears, they had a very important job indeed. So Mary Fields applied for the position, but she was not alone. You see, there were about 6 fellas that applied for the position too, cowboys about half her age. And Mary Fields, although she was a tough lady, she was already growing old. Miss Mary Fields was already all of 60 years old by the time she applied for this position. And although she was over 6 feet tall, although she was over 200 pounds, knew how to shoot her guns, knew how to ride a horse just as well as any man, she was older. Now, in order to win this position, to work for the United States Postal Service, you had to compete in a horse hitching contest. Now, what that was they challenged each contestant to hook up 4 white horses to a stagecoach, the fastest, and whoever did so would win them job. Now, I'm talking about Stagecoach Mary Fields. So what do we think happened? That's right. She won the position. Before you could say sarsaparilla Sunday, this lady had 4 white horses hooked up to the stagecoach. She had climbed all the way up into the driver's seat. She had those 2 shotguns. She had her flask of whiskey on her hip. She had her cigar hanging out of her mouth. And she was ready to ride. And that is how this lady became the first African-American person to work for the United States Postal Service. She would ride out in all kinds of weather through all kinds of dangers with her team of white horses and a beloved mule by the name of Moses to deliver every last letter she was given. She worked for about 8 years all by herself. She rode through all kinds of weather. She even had one situation where the snow had fallen so deep that her stagecoach got stuck out there in the snow. Her team had gotten stuck. So she had to pull all that mail in the sack on her back, and she had to trudge through 10 feet of snow in order to make it to every last recipient of those letters. There was another time where Mary Fields had her old stagecoach blown over in a storm. All her horses had gotten loose, and she had to protect herself of an evening against a pack of wolves that descended upon her camp with nothing but her 6 shooters and her shotgun. Miss Mary Fields was a tough lady, and like I said, she worked for those 8 years. She never failed to deliver a single letter. She never missed a day of work. And eventually, after all those years of working, Mary Fields decided she would retire. Miss Mary Fields came to live as the only African-American resident out there in Cascade. She had a laundry business for a while there, but she decided that she liked planting things in her garden. She liked playing with the neighborhood children. She liked watching baseball games a whole lot more than washing dirty clothes for smelly old cowboys. In fact, she loved baseball so much out there in Cascade that whenever any one of the men hit a home run, they would get a bouquet of flowers from Miss Mary Fields. One time, on her birthday of all times, they canceled all school in town, and all the children came over to Mary Fields' house to celebrate. And there was even a standing bet, even at 80 years old, that Miss Mary Fields could knock out any fella in the entire town. And nobody challenged her. Miss Mary Fields, around 1920, finally said goodbye to this world. But she didn't pass out of time. She's remembered in our amazing stories and in my letter. I think it's time to open it and see what's inside. So let's see here. It must be something important, right? So let's see. It is, in fact, a letter. It begins, "My dearest descendant." That's me. "My dearest descendant, I think my neighbor Pearl has been sneaking through my things again. I know what she is after." Must be something pretty important, right? "She is after my world-famous recipe for squirrel and cabbage stew." Squirrel and cabbage stew. "I've burned all the other copies but this one, and now it must be safe in your capable hands. Enjoy." I waited about 200 years for a squirrel and cabbage stew. Well, you know what? I'm not discouraged. You know, even though I didn't end up with money or fame or fortune, I sure learned a lot about an amazing lady who made a life according to her terms in the American West. And I'd say that's worth something too, right? So tell you what, I'm going to make my squirrel and cabbage stew, and I'm going to invite you all over to help me eat it. Does that sound good? Maybe some other time. Well, I've learned a lot about Miss Mary Fields, and I hope that, well, my amazing story inspires you all to create some amazing stories too. Thank y'all. Happy trails.